For those who aren't aware, Pastor Bartley over the last couple weeks brought us through a little bit of the context of Jonah. He told us a little bit about the life of Jonah and the setting that Jonah actually takes place in. And then last week, we went in chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 5. And so what I'm going to do to kick us off is I'm going to read chapter 1, verse 1 through 5, and then we'll continue our study today. We're going to start actually in verse 5, and we're going to move in through to verse 11. And if you're following along at home, I would encourage you to get a Bible, either on your app or on a real Bible, and follow along with us. I'm going to be reading from the New Living Translation today, and so if you have that version, it's probably the most effective for you to read along with us. If not, any version will do. And so open up your Bibles to Jonah, and I'm going to read for us in chapter 1, verse 1 through 4. It says, "The Lord gave this message to Jonah, son of Amittai. Get up and go to the great city of Nineveh. Announce my judgment against it, because I have seen how wicked its people are." But Jonah got up and went in the opposite direction to get away from the Lord. He went down to the port of Joppa, where he found a ship leaving for Tarshish. He bought a ticket and he went on board, hoping to escape from the Lord by sailing to Tarshish. But the Lord hurled a powerful wind over the sea, causing a violent storm that threatened to break the ship apart. So what we see here in Jonah is the beginning of the story is God calling a prophet of his, a Hebrew named Jonah, to go and deliver a message to a great city called Nineveh, which was a part of the Assyrian Empire. And the message was supposed to be a message of doom, but also a message of hope. Now, Jonah hears this call from God to go deliver a message to this great city, a city that he would have been intimidated by, and he would have feared. We'll learn more about that later as we go through the text. And so instead of following what God asked him to do, a very clear directive from God, Jonah takes off in the complete opposite direction. If you saw the map from last week, you would see that Nineveh is one way and Tarshish is the next way. And so Jonah jumps on a boat with a bunch of strangers and tries to escape from what God has asked him to do. And that's where we pick up the story. And so we're going to read now from verse 5 through verse 11. It says, "Fearing for their lives, the desperate sailors shouted to their gods for help and threw the cargo overboard to lighten the ship. But all this time, Jonah was sound asleep down in the hold. So the captain went down after him. 'How can you be asleep at a time like this?' he shouted. 'Get up and pray to your God. Maybe he will pay attention to us and spare our lives.' Then the crew cast lots to see which of them had offended the gods and caused the terrible storm. When they did this, the lots identified Jonah as the culprit. 'Why has this awful storm come down on us?' they demanded. 'Who are you? What is your line of work? What country are you from? What is your nationality?' Jonah answered, 'I am a Hebrew. I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land.' The sailors were terrified when they heard this, for he had already told them he was running away from the Lord. 'Oh, why did you do that?' they groaned. And since the storm was getting worse all the time, they asked him, 'What should we do to you to stop this storm?'" So like Pastor Wade said, we're going to go through this verse by verse. We're going to look at it verse by verse, and we're going to break it apart and see what we can learn from it this evening. We're going to start in verse 5. It says, "Fearing for their lives." The reason I want to start here is because I think it's important that we note what the author is saying about the sailors, that they are afraid for their lives. And what you're actually going to see in this section of scripture that we look at is you're going to see some character development of the sailors. They start afraid for their lives. They start in fear of their lives. And then we're going to see kind of where they end up by the end of today and going into future weeks. But I wanted to note that the sailors start with a fear for their lives. And then it goes on to say that the desperate sailors, they shouted to their gods for help. And the question obviously arises, who are these gods? Is this the God of Israel that they're shouting to? Is this a bunch of gods? Are they talking about the same God? Well, the reality was that they were probably praying to a bunch of different gods. The Joppa, where they all boarded a ship together, would have been a port town, and that's where a bunch of random people from all over the place would have been boarding ships. And most likely, they didn't know each other. A lot of them didn't know each other. They're all coming from different places all over the ancient Near East. And so they worshiped different gods. But they wanted to figure out what was going on and why it was going on. And so they all thought, you know what, I'll just pray to my God, you pray to your God, I'll pray to mine, and see if we can figure this thing out, because something is going wrong here. Now, again, these are sailors, right? These are not highly theological, highly sophisticated. These are more blue-collar type people. And when they're faced with trouble that they know that they're powerless against, they submit to the powers, the gods in their life. They know they can't really do anything about this great storm. And so they submit to the powers that they believe in, that they trust in. Like I said, these are clearly different gods, and they didn't really know which one would work, and so they all prayed to their own. So it continues on. It says they shouted for their gods and asked for help, but then they also threw cargo overboard to lighten the ship. So they prayed, but they also took some sort of actionable step. They weren't sure if they were going to get through this. They thought, you know what? The safest thing to do is get rid of all our stuff. Now, I'm not a sailor. I don't know if that helps. I'm assuming it does. But we continue on. It says, but all this time, Jonah was sound asleep down in the hold. All this crazy stuff is happening. All this commotion is happening. It's so bad. These are sailors. They're experienced. And so the storm was so bad that they're throwing their cargo overboard and they're praying to their gods. They're begging for mercy from their gods. And Jonah is down in the bottom of the boat, fast asleep. Now, the author appears to be suggesting something here. I think he's suggesting that Jonah's not just physically asleep. The picture he's painting is of somebody who's willfully ignoring the storm that is coming his way. So we don't normally sleep through something like this. And it seems as though Jonah's doing everything to ignore what he probably knew was coming his way. It kind of makes me think about nights where my wife and I, Ashton, are in a conflict. And if you know me, my personality type, lends to the type of person who can go to sleep in the middle of conflict. I don't have any problem falling asleep in the middle of conflict. Sometimes in my life, I look at the clock and I go, I'm not going to think well after 11 p.m., especially when I'm hungry. So the best thing for me to do is to go to sleep, wake up, have better cognitive function in order to deal with this. That's my personality type. But some people don't have that personality type. A lot of people have a hard time going to sleep in the midst of conflict. And so what this picture for me, the picture drew for me was when I'm laying there, going to sleep, totally fine, thinking I'm just going to wake up in the morning and deal with this. And my wife, there's conflict and she's having a hard time sleeping. She's frustrated. She's hurt. She's upset. And I'm just kind of avoiding it and sleeping it off and thinking everything's going to be fine. It's kind of a willful sleep. It's not just me going to sleep physically, but it's also me going to sleep on the damage and the hurt that I'm inflicting, or the consequences of my choices. It's me willfully kind of ignoring it. Now, I don't know about you, but have you ever found yourself willfully asleep to the chaos around you? Have you ever found yourself, the safest thing you feel like you can do is just escape it and just go to sleep and try to pretend it's not there and try to hope that it's not there when you wake up? And how often does that work? It doesn't work often for me. I know that for sure. But like I said, the picture that's painted is this willful sleep. And there's also this arrogance there. You notice this arrogance with Jonah, right? To think, you know what? I know I'm running away from God. I know I'm doing the wrong thing. I know there's going to be consequences for it. But if I just sleep this off, eventually God will leave it alone. He'll move on. No big deal. The arrogance of that is something, I don't know. I know all too well, I guess. And so verse 6 says, the captain, he went down after him. How can you sleep at a time like this? He shouted, get up, pray to your God, and maybe he will pay attention to us and spare our lives. So after trying all their own gods, none of that worked. They wondered maybe it's Jonah's God. Now, what does this tell us about the ancient Near East perspective? Think about it for yourself for a sec, or if you're me and you're on a ship and bad things are happening, the first thing I'm thinking is, who checked the weather network and how did they mess this up? How did they screw this up, right? That's my initial response. My initial response is usually a response of, there's got to be some sort of physical or material explanation to this. And so I'll start asking around, were you in charge of the weather network? Were you in charge of the weather network? Who messed this up? How are we in this circumstance? There has to be some sort of physical explanation to it. But that's not the worldview of these people. And maybe rightfully so. Their worldview was that if something was going wrong, then the gods were doing it. The gods were causing it. If something bad was happening that was totally out of their control, then there must be some explanation, like the gods were inflicting some sort of punishment. There was some sort of consequence for doing something wrong. And so that's their initial response, and that's their continual response to the scenario. Their first thing that they're thinking is, who messed up? What did they do? And what do we got to do to appease the gods to make all this better? You also have to understand that their perspective of the gods isn't necessarily the same that we have when we think of God. We're not talking about like a monotheistic worldview where there's one God and he's perfect in love and everything's good and nothing bad comes from him. These men, these sailors, would have had a worldview that included gods that were vindictive, gods that were out to get them, gods that were looking for them to mess up, gods that were angry at them for doing something wrong and just wanted to punish them to make them feel the pain. So they would have had this worldview, which is why they would have thought, who did this and what do we got to do to make it better, because we all don't want to die. That's the first thing to note about their worldview. Also notice, and this is kind of a theme through the book of Jonah, is the perspective of divine sovereignty. You see, the captain, what he said, get up and pray to your God, and he said, maybe he will pay attention to us and spare us our lives. Sometimes people from a pagan worldview, God can kind of be formulaic, where the gods can be, if you do this, then it equals this, and if you don't do this, then it doesn't equal this. But in Jonah, we actually don't see that. We see that even the captain of the ship is saying, look, do everything. Hopefully your God's going to spare us. We hope that he's kind and gracious enough to us to spare us our lives. But it wasn't guaranteed. They didn't know for sure. And we see later in Jonah's story, we see God not really following what Jonah's desires are. Because at the end of the day, God is God and Jonah is not. And so we continue on. After this, the crew, they cast lots. They still don't know necessarily if it's Jonah's God who's causing this. They don't know if it's Jonah's fault. And so something that they do is they cast lots. Now, what does that actually mean? When you hear casting lots, you just got to think about rolling dice. Think about flipping a coin, for example. There would be sticks or stones with symbols or markings on them. And what they would do when they couldn't make a decision themselves would basically be roll the dice, throw the sticks, cast the stones, and whatever the outcome is, they would all live with that outcome. And this is a very human thing. We understand this very well. We live like this still today in a lot of ways. Their perspective was, at the end of the day, if we can't figure it out, we'll blame the gods, and whatever the outcome is, that's what they wanted it to be. And so that's what they did in this circumstance. You can imagine if they were arguing about who did what and whose fault it was, if Jonah didn't own up to it, then they would be basically spending all night doing that. And so they decided to cast these lots to figure out whose fault this was. You also see casting lots in a few different places. Actually, a pretty common biblical practice. I want to show you a couple places you see it. You see it in 1 Chronicles 25, verse 8. It says, and they cast lots for their duties, all alike, the small as well as the great, the teacher as well as the pupil. The idea here is everyone's arguing about what their role should be, and it's like, we're never going to figure this out if we're all just arguing about it and trying to negotiate. So we might as well just all roll dice, flip coins, and whatever you get, we're going to trust that that's what God's plan is. You see it also in Matthew 27:35. It says, when they crucified him, it's talking about the Roman soldiers who crucified Jesus, they divided up his garments among themselves by casting lots. They decided who got what treasures just by rolling dice and flipping coins. In Acts 1:26, it says, and they drew lots for them, and the lot fell to Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles. Some of you may not realize this, but there were 12 disciples, and Judas was one of them, and Judas obviously betrayed Jesus, and so he kind of lost his spot. He also died, so they only had 11 left, but they needed 12. And so they actually cast lots to decide who the 12th disciple is. Isn't that crazy? You think you just left that to the flip of a coin or the roll of a dice? And the reality is, in their worldview, that was as good as just trusting in God's sovereignty and that God was in control in some respect. And this is pretty common in a lot of worldviews. We even do this today. Think about it. The Super Bowl, right? The biggest sporting event of the year for at least North America, the Western world, they decide who gets the ball first by flipping a coin. It's when you can't really decide something, you just kind of leave it to flipping a coin. But the view was that whatever the outcome was, that's ultimately what God would have wanted. And so what they're doing is they're casting lots. What are they casting lots for? To see which of them had offended the gods and caused the terrible storm. And what happens when they did this? Well, Jonah is the culprit. They find out this is all Jonah's fault. I'm not actually sure how they determined that, but there would have been some sort of predetermined order to this. So they would have known if this is the outcome, then obviously it means Jonah did it. And they were wrong. They were right about it. So they found out it was Jonah, and they asked him a few questions. They said, why is this awful storm coming to us? All of our lives are at risk. All of our futures are at risk. What's happening? Why is it coming to us? They said, who are you? What is your line of work? What country are you from? What is your nationality? You may wonder, in the midst of a storm where all their lives are at stake, why are they interrogating Jonah in this way? Well, there's a few different reasons, there are a few different ways to look at it. The one way to look at it is the author's trying to tell us something. The author of Jonah is trying to get us to ask the question, why are they asking these questions? And the reason is that they're setting us up for something, and we'll show you what the author's setting us up for in just a moment. You see, we already know in the story what happened. We know that it was Jonah's fault, and we know why, but the sailors don't. And so the author's saying, remember what happened and why. I'm going to show you in a sec. But also, in reality, why would these sailors be asking the question? Well, there's a few things that they want to learn about Jonah. Jonah paid to come on the ship. They didn't know Jonah. Nobody knew him. So they didn't know what his background was. They didn't know where he was coming from. They didn't know the gods he worshipped. And they didn't know how much trouble they were in. Well, they were about to find out. What they would find out from answering these questions is who Jonah's ancestors were and what tribes he came from and therefore what gods he worshipped. They would be able to try to relate to the gods he worshipped. They might know them, they might not. They would try to understand and get the most amount of information they could possible about what was happening and who was doing this to them by asking these questions. And they'd also understand things about Jonah. They don't know how bad of a guy he is. They don't know if he's a good guy and it's just a bad God who's trying to hurt him, and if they should protect him, or they don't know if he's a bad guy and they should throw him over ship. They don't know any of this information, so they're trying to understand how to respond. Then we see in Jonah verse 9, it says, Jonah answered, I am a Hebrew. Now, the sailors and the mariners, they would have known who the Israelites are, and so that would have told them a lot about Jonah. And then it says, I worship the Lord, the God of heaven. Now, other translations, they actually use the language of I fear the Lord, which I like that language better. What would they have understood this to mean? They would have understood that Jonah is talking about a very big God. They would have understood that Jonah is talking about like a super God, like a Lord of Lords, like a God of gods. We're talking God of heaven here. So they understand that this is not some small God that they could manipulate or control. We're talking about a big God who's powerful, who can do a lot, and we should be worried, which is why they responded the way they did in a minute. He also says, this is the God who made the sea and the land. Now, this would have confirmed for the sailors that this was the God who was causing the storm. You see, the irony in the statement here is that Jonah says to them, he says, I am a Hebrew who fears the Lord, and this is the Lord, this is the God of heaven and the God of the land and the seas. But what the sailors are seeing is obviously Jonah's not living in accordance with his identity. He's not living in accordance with what he says about himself. He doesn't actually fear the Lord because something bad's happening and it's his fault and it's happening on the sea. And so if this is the God of the seas and of the earth, then this God's mad at Jonah for doing something. So he's not fearing him in the way that he is communicating that he is, or that at least that is his identity. So you see the irony there. We're going to see a little bit more irony in a sec here. The sailors, it says they were terrified after this. So they started out scared. Now they're absolutely terrified. They have learned now that Jonah is a Hebrew. He worships this God, like this ultimate God, this big God, this God of heaven, and he did something really bad, and this God has control over the earth and the seas. They are frightened to death. They're terrified, and then they get to a point where they groan. Oh, why did you do it, it says. Why did you do it, they groan. They're upset with him. They're like, what is wrong with you? You say you're a God-fearing man. You say you fear this God, except for you're living in such a way that's causing all of this destruction and consequence. What did you do wrong, and why did you do it? What's the irony here? The man of God, the prophet, the one who fears the Lord, he doesn't actually, in fact, fear the Lord. It's also the prophet in this scenario who lacks faith. You see, the sailors are the ones who actually have faith. The sailors are the ones who have the right kind of faith. Jonah, he takes things into his own hands. He tries to control God. He tries to manipulate God. He tries to run away from God's plan, thinking that he can do that and suffer no consequences. The sailors, on the other hand, when something happens to them, they immediately submit themselves to the gods, to the powerful, and they beg for mercy. You see, the irony here is that the prophet is the one who is lacking a fear of the Lord, and the sailors are the one who actually have a genuine fear of the Lord. Jonah answers it as his identity marker, as his occupation, but it's the sailors who are actually living it out. And this is kind of where I want to slow down for a second. I want to camp out, because I think this is where we can learn a few things, and I think this is where we can start to do a little bit of a self-audit. If you're a professing Christian and you're watching right now, I want you to seriously ask yourself a few questions. I want you to ask yourself this: how often is your faith an identity marker rather than a lived experience? How often is your faith an identity marker rather than an actual lived experience? How often is your followership of Jesus a badge of honor rather than an actual daily practice? How often is your fear of the Lord a family motto rather than a family lifestyle? How often is this the case? You say I'm a Christian, but you don't live like it. You say you are something, but your lifestyle doesn't reflect it. You see, it's the pagan sailors that they feared, they prayed, they hoped, they trusted. It's the prophet who ran away. It's the prophet who avoided. It's the prophet who just slept it all off. It's the blue-collar pagans who moved towards fearing God, and it's the prophet who moved away from fearing God. It's the simple pagans who understood that they don't have any control, and it's the prophet that messed everything up by trying to grasp control. I don't know if that's for you, but I know that's for me a lot of the time. I run into non-churched people who pray more than I do at times. I run into lay church people who their simple faith and their simple obedience works way better for them than me overcomplicating something or trying to deconstruct something. I like to maintain control, and I admire those who easily let go of it. Maybe that's not for you. Maybe you're different than me, but maybe this is for you. How often do people around you suffer the consequences of your disobedience? How often do people miss hearing the message of salvation that they so desperately need? Nineveh needed this so badly. How often do people miss the message of salvation that they desperately need because you're running from God? How often are innocent bystanders, like the sailors, going through a storm because you won't get right with God? How often is that happening in your life? If you're not a committed Christian yet, I got a couple thoughts for you. I want you to think about this. If you don't claim to follow Jesus, that's okay. I'm glad you're here, but I want you to think about some things too, because you're not off the hook. You can and often are a Jonah as well in your own life, in your own story. Do you hold yourself to a lower standard than you hold others? Do you stand on your social media soapbox and wear your identity markers with pride, yet behind the scenes your life is actually a mess and you're deeply confused? Do you run away from what you know may be the truth about God just because you're afraid of what it's going to cost you and what you got to give up? Are you a Jonah and Nineveh's actually genuine faith in Jesus? And you're looking at it going, I know that's where I'm supposed to go, but I'm terrified of it? Are you a Jonah running away from God, running away from belief and action that you know you should be living out and trusting in. You're heading in the opposite direction of where you should be going. Maybe you're running right now. Maybe you're a Jonah and you're sleeping at the bottom of the ship and you're hoping that God's just going to give up on you and leave you alone. I've got really bad news for you. He won't. God's not going to stop pursuing you. You can run all you want, and God's going to continue to pursue you. He's going to continue to nag on your heart and draw you to himself. There's a few reasons why. For one, this God loves you. He loves you deeply. He loves you more than anybody loves you. And a God who loves you doesn't give up on you. He wants you. And he wants you more than anything and anyone. He also has a plan for you. Just like he had a plan for Jonah. He had a specially designed plan for Jonah. And he needed Jonah's obedience in order to accomplish that plan. He wanted Jonah to do this thing. So he wasn't going to give up on him. And the same is true of you. God loves you, and he has a plan for you. And he's not going to give up on you. You can continue to run away, but God's not going to stop at anything in his pursuit of you. In your running away, you're going to continue to cause a muck of your life. You're going to continue to make a mess of it. And God's going to be okay with that. He's going to keep coming towards you. He's going to keep trying to draw you towards himself because he loves you, and he has a plan for you. And the reality is that we know that you don't want to keep running away from God. We know that's scary, and you don't want to, but you think it's the only thing you can do. And the reality is that you don't have to. Jonah didn't have to run away from God. God has given him, Jonah, the choice to obey or run away and experience all the hardship from running away. And the same is true of you in your life. I want to invite you to be a sailor. I want you to invite you to think about being a sailor. Quit being a Jonah and be a sailor. You can trust in God. You can fear God. You can submit yourself to him, and you can allow God to calm the storms in your life. You can allow God to spare your life, and you can allow him to use you to accomplish his plans, the ones that he set in advance for you. You can do that. You have the power. You have the freedom of choice to do that. And we at Renew Church, we invite you to at least consider that. Or maybe stop moving in the opposite direction and maybe just take one step towards Nineveh in the right direction. I want to read verse 11, and then we're going to pass it over to Wade. It says in verse 11, "And since the storm was getting worse all the time, they asked him, 'What should we do to you to stop the storm?'" I find it interesting that even after all of this, they actually ask Jonah for his judgment. They say, "Look, this is your God. This is your mess. You tell us how to get out of this, and we'll trust you." They seek his insight. He's still a prophet of God. He still should know better. They trust that he knows better. And the reality is he did know better. And my belief is that the reality is that you do know better. Whether you're a Christian and you're running, whether you're a Christian and you're avoiding God's call for your life and the things he's asked you to do, or you're not quite yet, you do know better, just like Jonah knew better. We're going to pick up next Thursday and see what ends up happening to Jonah in this story. Thanks for joining us.